that a person lives on. There's eternity through the Torah that is learned in his merit, through the heritage that he leaves with the family that continues on. And it gives him eternity, gives him netzach in this world, and all of us. And we all know that in the story of Hanukka, we say in Ala Nisim that Yavan al-Sha'ah wanted to lashkicham toratecha ve'la'aviram michukei retzonecha. It was a spiritual battle. They wanted to annihilate us, not only physically, but spiritually. And what we are doing here, learning Torah, keeping the mitzvot, deepening our connection to Hashem, to the nation, to the land, is the biggest answer to Yavan and to anyone who wants to destroy us. We know that we will persevere. Am Yisrael Chai. So we should have a Hanukka Sameach. There are no classes next week. And okay, Tzipi is saying that I should say the Hakdashah again. I want to tell everyone on Zoom that you're not here, you won't get sufganiyot, but you will get the sweetness of the Torah of Matan. So the seminar is dedicated to the memory of Dr. Charles Harold Feldman. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you.
Okay, because we had technical hitch, my time is limited, which means we're going to be going very fast.
You talk fast.
You're going to
have about 50 people on Zoom.
Hi, Zoom people. Wonderful to have you with us as well. So you're going to have to all be super concentrated. And I'm going to have to be super concise, which is super difficult for me, but we're going to get there together. I want to speak today. The title is Hanukka Then and Now, the Fight for Light. And I want to tell you that having looked and read over the last few weeks, the Hanukka story, I realized how poignantly real it is for our times. If you actually go back, and one place where I think he tells the story beautifully is in Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg's book, The Living Way, The Jewish Way, The Living Way, I think it's called, where he speaks about Hanukkah. And you can really see the story there. You understand that it begins with the idea of Hellenization, which we'll speak about as we go. And then basically there was infighting. There was a fighting between the Jews themselves. Mm-hmm. And then eventually what happens, Antiochus IV believes that they're rebelling against him, and he comes and he basically just, does everything he does, puts laws against the Jews. But ultimately, there is also, and here I want to speak about today, there is also a revolutionary paradigm shift that happens within the Jewish people, in which they move away from a kind of passive, pietist, what we call the Hasidim way of understanding that God's going to come down, we just need to be passive martyrs, God's going to come down and save us, to the Maccabean way of understanding reality, understanding history, in which we work covenantally with God in order to bring about a new reality. The other thing about the Hanukkah story is that if you look at what was going on at the time, at the individualism, the Hellenistic outlook, the idea of imposing a universal agenda, which by they believed that they owned or possessed the ultimate truth at the expense of the life of everybody else. It's clear again, once again, that the Jews, and by the way, that was a moment in history which turned the whole historical reality of not just the Middle East, but the whole world, okay, for many different reasons. And the Jews were at the center. That's why we have a lot of non-Jewish sources that tell the Hanukkah story. By the way, no other festival, no other Chag in Judaism do we find in external sources except for Hanukkah. The irony is that Maccabees 1 and 2, the two books of Hanukkah, were not integrated into the Tanakh. And that's for another time, but perhaps we'll touch on it today. So I want to go back. So already I want to say Hanukkah is a story that really is so poignantly suitable and real and applicable to our times. But today I want to talk about the difference between the survival of the fittest and the survival of the spirit. What is the difference between the two? And I want to begin with Darwin. Darwin, we know, very famously speaks about the idea of the survival of the fittest. And for Darwin, what he did, and he again revolutionized the way in which we see humans, the way in which we see ourselves, the way in which humanity addresses its own consciousness. Charles Darwin, in 1859, The Origins of the Species, he speaks about the idea that biologically, materialistically, not materialistically in terms of, materialist, but meaning just looking at the world, looking at the way in which we work as humans physically, physiologically in the world, we will see, and he did this through obviously years and years and years of studying different species, we will always be the selfish gene, the gene that talks about the idea of how I'm going to survive is always what is going to dominate. And I want to very, very quickly read with you what he wrote in 1859. He says like this: owing to this struggle, it should be on your source sheets, owing to the struggle for life, any variation, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if it be in any degree profitable to any individual of any species, in its infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to external nature, will tend to the preservation of that individual and will generally be inherited by its offspring. Okay, meaning what allows us to survive is what we pass down to our offspring. One general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely multiply vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. It makes the works of God a mere mockery and deception. I would almost as soon believe with the old and ignorant cosmogonists that fossil shells had never lived and had been created in stone so as to mock the shells now living on the Dead Sea shore. It's very clear that Darwin was mocking God. What was he actually mocking? He was mocking the idea, he was making light of the idea that there was a first being that created humans as we see them today. For Darwin, humans came by way of a process in which the survival of the fittest was what dominated the evolutionary process of the species. For Darwin, what is the law of the materialist existence is that the strongest element of a species is what is going to survive. And what he's talking about there is the strongest element is the physical element of the species. What is strong, what allows me to biologically exist, that is what's going to survive. Of course, this first and foremost took out the idea of sacredness. Sacredness was taken out of the picture. There wasn't this idea of sacredness. It was all very biological, very materialist approach to reality. But the irony is that in 1871, in one of the last books that Darwin writes, The Descent of Man, Darwin begins to understand that maybe there is more than just the survival of the fittest. And what he realizes is that actually, it's not just about the selfish gene of man, but actually also it's about the idea of sometimes acting altruistically in groups, right? That allows us to survive. I want to read with you the second source from Darwin. As man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instinct and sympathies to all members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. What does Darwin says? Darwin talks here about the idea that sympathy, okay, to the people that are like me is something that we find that almost seems an anomaly to his theory of survival of the fittest. Because in survival of the fittest, I will do what is selfishly right for me, and I won't have sympathy for somebody because sympathy makes me what? Weak and vulnerable. But yet Darwin recognizes, and this is decades later, because even though he wrote The Origins of Species in 1859, he had already been researching it for decades before that, so he already had his theory. So decades later, Darwin, after more research, realizes that human beings may act in a different way to what he originally anticipated or originally believed, different to the way animals do. Although he also does say that animals also have a sympathetic gene, but that's something else. And ultimately what he says here is that there is something about the way in which humans survive that require, or that somehow for some reason show that humans work or act in groups, and there is some element of sympathy. There's an element of recognizing that there's something bigger than just the individual selfish human that creates this sense of community, or I mean, he doesn't call it community, but I imagine that's what he would talk about. And he even speaks about the idea of a common good. I'm just going to continue two more lines. A tribe including many members who, from possessing in a high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes. And this would be natural selection. Now, I don't want to go into Darwin's theory here. Number one, because I don't understand it properly. And number two, because it's way beyond the scope of the about 40 minutes that we have left. However, what I think we see is very clear, is that at the beginning, Darwin spoke about survival of the fittest of the individual. The individual will always opt, right, and will always pass down to the next generation the genes or the character traits that allow them to survive. And later on, Darwin recognizes that there is something more than just biological kind of strength. There is also strength, and it seems to be something that's almost counterintuitive. There seems to be a strength in the idea of a group of people working towards the common good, which will sometimes be victorious even over those who are stronger physically. Okay? Now, I want to bring in Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who talks about Darwin and summarizes it brilliantly in his book, The Great Partnership. And once again, what this book does is it speaks about science and religion. And Rabbi Sacks in the book begins the book with two narratives, what he calls narrative one and narrative two. And he says that as human beings, we have a choice which narrative we choose. Narrative one is that basically the narrative of the Big Bang, that we are just a very, like Darwin exactly speaks, that there was a very, very small chance that humans would ever come into being. But because of various factors and because of fate, humans came into being. But it was very, very, it was just by chance, right? And that's the way we exist. We exist by chance. We exist by fate. And then, you know what? Our being could have been, and it could not have been, right? And that's the way we continue surviving. The other narrative is that we're here for a reason, that there was a power that created us and that wants to communicate with us and gives us a role in this world. And there is purpose and there is meaning. Now, they are not, says Rabbi Sacks, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. These two narratives can work hand in hand. We can, says Rabbi Sacks, have a way of looking at the world that is scientific, and we can have a way of looking at the world that is religious. Scientific is left brain, according to Rabbi Sacks. That is that we see the world, we ask the question, how does the world work? And religion is right brain. That is that we ask the question, why? What is the purpose? What is the meaning? One is about explanation, one is about meaning. And I want to suggest that what Darwin does in the first and second books that he writes, in the first book, he is looking at it as a scientist. He is trying to explain how humans came to be. But in the second book, he's already beginning to understand that there's something more to human survival than just an explanation. There is what I would call the survival of the spirit, okay, or the power of the spirit. And the power of the spirit, in some senses, transcends scientific explanation. It transcends a materialist way of looking at the world. It transcends a purely biological explanation to our survival. And the Jewish people, to me, represent not survival of the fittest, but survival of the spirit. And that's what I want to journey with you on today. Rabbi Sacks writes like this: biological evolution favors individuals but cultural evolution favors groups. Here he's summarizing Darwin. Religion binds people into groups. It creates altruism, the only force strong enough to defeat egoism. Selfishness is good for me and my genes, but bad for us, and therefore bad for my descendants in the long run. In Homo sapiens, a miracle of nature meets a miracle of culture. Religion which turns selfish genes into selfless people. Biological evolution favors individual, but cultural evolution favors groups. Oh, I think it's a mistake. Sorry. I've repeated the same sentence.
Important.
Where are we going? Hold on. But bad for us, and therefore my sense of in Homo sapiens, a miracle of nature. No, something's gone totally wrong here. No, it's gone wrong. There's something wrong with the source. Okay, we're going to leave the source aside. I apologize. I don't know what happened. Is that just mine? No, that's yours as well, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, fine. Okay. So now I want to look at Hanukka. Ironically, Hanukka has actually two narratives in our religious consciousness. Mm-hmm. It has what I would call narrative one, which is a more naturalistic approach, and narrative two, which is a more transcendent approach. But I want to introduce to you a third narrative called narrative three, and that is what I'm going to call the covenantal narrative. But let's begin with the naturalistic approach. The naturalistic approach comes in the book of Maccabees. By the way, it comes really in the first book of Maccabees. There's two books of Maccabees. Maccabees 1 speaks about the battle, the military victory. It's very naturalistic. It looks at it from a totally kind of historical perspective. Maccabees 2 is more spiritual. It definitely speaks more to the religious consciousness, but it's still quite naturalistic. And that was, by the way, one of the reasons why it wasn't put in to the biblical canon, because it was too naturalistic. And because of the legacy of the Hasmoneans, it's a very long historical story, but ultimately the Hasmoneans in the end became corrupt. And the rabbis later did not want that story to be the Hasmonean story to be integrated as it was into the biblical canon. And that's why it wasn't integrated. But in Maccabees 2, I just want to read you this part. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices. The book of Maccabees speaks really very little about the miracle. In fact, almost doesn't mention the miracle of the oil. It speaks about the fact that the humans were able to reignite the fire of the sacrifices and the menorah. Josephus, who we know is the historian of that time, he also speaks about the Hanukkah story, and this is what he says. Now Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and omitted no source of pleasures thereon, but he feasted them upon very rich and splendid sacrifices, and he honored God and delighted them with hymns and psalms. Nay, they were so very glad at the revival of their customs when, after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of their worship, and they made it a law for their posterity. And they should keep a festival on account of the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate the festival and call it lights. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that thence was the name given to the festival. What's wrong with this source from a religious perspective?
There's no God. I just want them to
There's no miracle.
No, nothing, right?
There's no miracle of what we're celebrating for 8 days of Hanukkah, which is what? That we found one pot of oil and it lasted for 8 days. No mention of the miracle. This is a totally naturalistic way of looking at the history of the Hanukkah story. Okay, it is basically the survival of the fittest. This army, the Jewish army, was stronger, okay, than Antiochus' army, and we beat them very simply. Okay, and then we reinstated the temple and put back everything as it needed to be. In total contrast to that, we have the story of Hanukkah in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in Shabbat. Listen to this story. What is my Hanukkah? What is Hanukkah? On the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah, they are 8, not to eulogize them, not to fast on them. When the Greeks entered the temple, they polluted all the oils in the temple. And when the Hasmonean dynasty overcame and defeated them, one very small sentence, right? They checked and they found but one cruse of oil that was set in place with the seal of the high priest. There was in it only enough to light a single day. A miracle was done, and they lit it for 8 days. The following years, the sages fixed those days, making them holidays for praise and thanksgiving. What is the difference between these two stories? I would argue that the difference between these two stories is what we call the Darwinian approach, right? And the religious approach, right? The naturalist approach to reality and the religious approach to reality. I'm being binary here on purpose. In a minute, I'm going to combine them. But I'm doing it on purpose because ultimately, what was the rabbinic polemic here? Why did, when they asked what is Hanukka, why did they not focus on the battle? Because what? Because what were they worried about? They were worried that we would become arrogant, that we would become naturalist, that we would actually adopt a Hellenized way of looking at reality. They understood that Hellenism, even though it may have been defeated by the time the sages came to writing the Talmud, Hellenism was always a threat. The Hellenized way of looking reality is always a danger that exists. And therefore the rabbi said what? Don't focus on the military battle because that's not really the miracle. The miracle is that God gave us light, that God did something totally miraculous. And that's what the miracle is. And so they, in some senses, absolutely, they literally deconstruct, I should say. They deconstruct, right? The perhaps maybe true historical picture in order to insert into the Jewish memory, Jewish identity, Jewish character, a divine story. What Rabbi Sachs would call narrative 2, the narrative of transcendence, the narrative of religion. I want to suggest that Hanukka brings a third alternative, not an alternative that focuses just on a naturalist way of looking at reality, and not an alternative that focuses just on an almost passive religious reality, which basically says we as humans shouldn't do anything. And by the way, that was the view of the pietists, of the Hasidim at the time. They said, we need to just be passive and be martyrs because God must be punishing us in the same way he punished us when the first temple was destroyed. He's punishing us through Antiochus and the Greeks and everything else with this, what's going on now. And therefore we must just accept the reality, accept this is what's happening, and die as martyrs in the hands of the Greeks. The Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, present a third paradigm, and it's revolutionary. What do they say? Neither this nor this. Instead, what they say is, we need both. We need to combine. We need to understand that in covenant, a covenantal approach to reality is an approach that understands that in order for us to survive, we need a combination of survival of the fittest and survival of the spirit. And we do that through being consciously religious, conscious of God's transcendence in the world, but at the same time not remaining passive, waiting for ourselves to die. They triumphed. For the first time ever, they championed the idea of the priority of life. The pietists said, we can't fight on Shabbat because Shabbat is sacred, more sacred than anything else. The Hasmoneans said what? We must fight on Shabbat because what is more important than anything is the survival of our nation and the survival of the sacredness of life. And this, by the way, was a revolutionary way of thinking, and it seeped into our consciousness. Why do you think when the pioneers, the Zionist pioneers came to Israel, the one Chag they still celebrated was what? Hanukka. Hanukka is in some ways the Chag of secular Zionism. Okay, because that, and by the way, they've also got it wrong. because they've forgotten the other narrative, the Shabbat narrative, the narrative we just read, which is also very much part of the Jewish consciousness, the Jewish way of identifying what Hanukkah is. But now I want to show you three. In fact, we're not going to read all of them because we don't have time. And I'm going to show you the Al Hanissim prayer, which you say, which combines both. And I want to show you there are sources that combine both. Rambam, Maimonides, and the Mishnah Torah also combines both. The Kedusha Halevi, Levi Yitzchak B'Ditchev, he in his commentary, that we're not going to read all of it, he also combines both. Listen to what the Al Hanissim, Va'al Pugim, Va'al Gvorot, Va'al Tshuot, Va'al HaMilchamot, She'asita L'Avotenu B'Yamim Hahem B'Zman Hazeh. It mentions the Nisim, but it also mentions what? The Milchama. And then it says, B'Yimei Matzah ben Yochanan Kohen HaGadol, U'vanav she'amda Malchut Yaven Harashal Amcha Yisrael Ashkichen Toratecha. And it mentions the Torah. What was the aim of the Malchut of Yavan? To destroy the Torah and to wipe us out, all our laws. Okay, and you, V'ata Berechamecha, you, God, okay, you, God, fought the battle for us. You are the ones that that you put the weak, the strong in the hands of the weak, right? But what does the Al Hanissim prayer say? At the end of the day, it understands that it was a joint effort, that without the battle, we wouldn't have won. That it was the human initiative, the human autonomy, human way of looking at reality that said, we need to fight this battle. We need to understand that it's up to us to fight the battle of God. The Mishnah Torah, also the Rambam says, he brings in both as well. In the era of the Second Temple, the Greek kingdom issued decrees against the Jewish people to nullify their faith, and do all the terrible things they did, and the Jews suffered, etc., right? And he gives the whole story. And then the sons of Hazaniah, the high priest, overcame them, slew them, saved the Jews from their hand, appointed a king for the priests, returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the destruction of the Second Temple. There is a very historical slant on what Maimonides and what Rambam says here. And when the Jews overcame their enemies and destroyed them, they entered the sanctuary on the 25th of Kislev. They couldn't find, which isn't 100% true, by the way. They waited 2 months. It was actually during the time of Sukkot that the battle happened. They waited 2 months in deference to the pietists, to the Hasidim, that said, God will bring the new temple down from heaven. And they said, okay, we'll wait. And they waited and they waited and they waited. And eventually it came to 2 months later on the 25th of Kislev, which was the date that the previous temple had been rededicated in the times of Haggai. They said, fine, God hasn't brought it down, we're doing it ourselves. And that's why Hanukkah is celebrated on the 25th of Kislev, even though the battle took place during Sukkot. I just want to tell you how I've been thinking about this so much recently, okay? That the battle started during Sukkot, right? Halavai v'halavai, it would end during Hanukkah, right? But I'm saying is in this period, how relevant it is in terms of also what the Battle of Hanukkah is. It's so, I can't tell you, every time I read the history again and again, I keep saying to myself how history repeats itself, but the whole idea of what happened during Hanukkah, how people also, the high priests the high priests who basically used the temple in the end for Hellenism, they paid Antiochus because Antiochus needed money, he needed taxes to fight his war in Syria. So they paid him a great amount of money so that they could receive the appointment of the high priests. And then between themselves, they had arguments. And one slayed the other. And then Antiochus thinks to himself, oh, hold on a minute, they're rebelling against me, even though it's actually infighting. And then he basically starts setting out all these laws against the Jews. But the whole battle, the whole story here is so poignant. And now I want to develop it further. So we've seen this idea of these two narratives, and what I brought in, which is the third narrative, the narrative, or I should say the covenantal approach, which was a new paradigm at the time of the Jewish people at that time. It was a new paradigm that said we don't need to just sit and be passive, but at the same time, we definitely do not need to be assimilationist. We don't need to be Hellenized, because that will, our Jewish identity will totally be lost. Another point, by the way, I mean, I could go on and on about this because it's unbelievably, profoundly relevant. Another point was there were many, many hundreds of thousands of Jews who had Hellenized and assimilated, okay? And when the Hasmoneans started fighting, many of those Hellenized Jews suddenly returned. And they said, oh, do you know what? My Jewish identity is actually something I quite admire. And they joined the Hasmonean battle against Greece, against Antiochus, okay, which again is another very interesting point. I now want to take it a level further. I want to speak about the idea of the Greek and the Jewish view of man. What is the difference between the Greek and Jewish view? Now, there is a very kind of ambivalent approach to Greece. And by the way, here I don't want to get into it, but there's quite a big difference between Greek mythology and Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy is an outgrowth of Greek mythology, but we're going to just ban them all under the same thing for the minute, okay? But they are very different. Here we're talking more about Greek philosophy. We're talking about more about Greek philosophy. And there's an ambivalent view. Sometimes we hear it's a good thing, and sometimes we hear it's a bad thing. I brought you a few different things. Look at source number 10 from Pe'ah. It's permissible to teach one daughter's Greek wisdom because it's a tachshit. Okay, what does it say about Greek wisdom? It says there's something about Greek wisdom that is beautiful. That is something we should have. It's something we should adorn ourselves with, but it's external. Every time we meet Greek wisdom or Greek philosophy or the Greek way of looking at life in the Gemara, in the Jewish religious sources, there is something about the religious sources that say, we need to know it, we need to understand it, but we also need to understand that it's superficial, that it's about the external. Look at source number 11. During Vespasian's war, they decreed against the groom wearing a wedding crown. During Titus's war, they decreed the bridal crown that should not teach. They decreed against the bridal crown, and also they shouldn't teach his son Greek wisdom. So on the one hand, you should teach it. On the other hand, you shouldn't teach it. I want to bring in what Rav Lichtenstein says. Rav Lichtenstein's Zatzal, he speaks about the idea of God and man according to Judaism and Hellenism. He says like this: the Greeks believe that the existence in its totality is comprehensible and conquerable. Remember Darwin, everything is what we see. Okay, there's nothing transcendent, there's no God, there's no, creation story. The universe contains no mystery, reflects no greater power. Man can master all creation. Today's conception of mastery is different. We think of dominating the world in the physical sense, to harness the universe's power and use it to produce. But the Greek conception of mastery meant domination through conceptualization and categorization, fitting the universe into the confines of cognition. Their purpose was understanding purely for the sake of understanding. To summarize the Greek outlook on the universe was that all that which is revealed and perceptible is all there is. All is within man's grasp to understand. Creation contains laws and order, harmony and beauty, which give man the ability to conquer and dominate the universe with his intellect. I'm not going to read the second point, but the second point is that the Greeks became or understood that the main emphasis in the world was the centrality of man. Man was the be-all and end-all, okay? And nature was important, but man remained at the center. And then the question is, what is the Jewish view? What is the ultimate? I'm going to skip Avraham Yeshua Heschel, even though it's absolutely beautiful. We don't have time, but what Avraham Yeshua Heschel essentially speaks about is the difference between Greece and Judaism, or Greek, Athens and Jerusalem, right? Whereas for the Greek, everything, for the biblical mind, God is beyond nature. Our existence is beyond nature. But for the Greeks, everything was within nature. Okay? And the Maharal also speaks about something very, very similar. I want to come to source number 17, which is Rav Chagall. Rav Chagall speaks, and again, Rav Chagall is very, very difficult to understand, okay? But he was a brilliant mind. He was what I would call maybe one of the primary postmodern thinkers, rabbis, thinkers of the time. He died at a very young age. And he speaks about Hanukka in a fascinating way. Okay, he brings in the pasuk from Bereshit that speaks about the idea of Yafa Elokim liyafat yishkan ba'olei Shem, right? Yefet, right? Yefet, which a lot of commentators say is Greece, there's something beautiful about Yefet. Yefet, beautiful, it's an adornment, it's a tachshit, but it has to reside within the tent of Shem, Shem being the Jews, right? Listen to what Rav Shagar says. Many commentators understand the holiday of Hanukkah as the holiday which more than any other expresses the complex tension between the contact of Torah with wisdom and culture, with wisdoms and culture. According to these understanding, the war between the Greeks and the Maccabees was not about independence and control, rather a culture war over the purity of the jug of oil that represents the wisdom of Torah, a war that Judaism fights against the wisdom of Greece. What Rav Shagar does is another brilliant thing. He says, yes, historically, it was a military battle, obviously, but we always have to look under the surface. Okay, that's the difference between a religious consciousness and a non-religious consciousness. A religious consciousness will always be searching for the meaning, will always be asking the question, what does it mean? Whereas a non-religious consciousness will just be saying, what happens? What do we see? And Rav Shagar is saying here that the battle is not just a battle, a physical military battle. It's also a battle about what is the meaning of our existence. For the Greeks, it was what you see is what there is. For the Jews, it's that there was something more than what we can just see with the eye. That's why you can teach Greek to your daughter and your son. That's why Greek wisdom is, by the way, even within the religious sources, even within the Talmud and the Mishnah, is revered. Greek and Greek culture is revered, but only to a degree. Only when we understand and contextualize it and understand that it is the external. It is, in some ways, what Rabbi Sachs says, it's about science. Today we'd call it science, but it's about philosophy, science. It's about categorization. It's about how we understand. We need categorization in order to understand our world, in order to develop, in order to be dignified beings, in order to find cures to diseases. We need to categorize. We need to understand the world. We need to ask how. We need to explain. But in order to survive as human beings, not just physically, but with resilience, with spirit, we need to have a whole nother narrative. And that's what Rav Shagar says is the Ohalei Shem. The Ohalei Shem is the tent. It's the inside. It's the jug of oil in the sanctuary. It's the internal. The term external, I'm going to continue, external wisdom was viewed throughout Jewish history to refer to Greek wisdom. External wisdom is not evil wisdom. It simply belongs to the outside, meaning it lacks the intimacy of being with itself. And as its source, it is an objectification of the knowledge. Hence, the conflict between Torah and Greek wisdom does not have to focus on the context of the wisdom or language used, but on the intimacy and personal identity, the intimacy and identity that are the eros of wisdom. The distinction between the wisdom of Greece and the wisdom of Torah is between the beauty of Yefet and the tents of Shem. Yefet, the biblical father of Greece, who symbolizes Greekness, is the wisdom that is beautiful and effective, but lacks all passion and intimacy. Shem, representing Torah, is a wisdom overflowing with meaning and is intimacy, a revelation of existence and substantive content. Okay, I'm going to skip. I'm going to leave that for, again, you can read it on your own time. What Rav Shagar is saying to us here is that they are both important. The wisdom of Greece is important. It brings categorization. It brings a wisdom of how to understand our world. It brings a way in which we can appreciate aesthetics as well as anything else. But if it is the only way we look at the world, we will very quickly, although it took many hundreds of years, veer towards a Darwinian way of understanding reality. If, however, we take Greek wisdom and we marry it with the internal wisdom, the particular way of understanding things that Judaism brings. The revelation, the flame within, the intimacy, the covenantal relationship between man and God, then we will have a much bigger picture. I brought Rabbi Sachs again. He says like this: the Greeks thought of knowledge as a kind of seeing, and modern science tells us that we can no longer see meaning when we look at nature. On this, the atheists are right. Galaxies are born, stars explode, planets form, species emerge, spread, and become extinct. There is nothing meaningful about this whatsoever, so long as we stay in the world of subject and object, seeing and testing, theorizing, experimenting, the left brain world that takes things apart to see how they work. But meaning as covenant never was seen. I'm going to stop here. Try to explain through categorization the love you have for your child. Try to explain through scientific data the altruism it takes to drive over the country and put yourself on the line, saving your people again and again and again until you're killed. Explain that through scientific data. Explain that through survival of the fittest and Darwin's theory. You cannot. That is covenantal love. It is heard as the voice of God. It is not found by maids. It belongs to the intersubjective world of persons in relation to one another. I'm going to skip right till the end. Sacred meanings, it's 4 lines up from the bottom. Sacred meanings are those we make when we covenant with God, listening to his voice, heeding his call, because one of the covenant partners is God. Sacred covenants never die because God never abandons humanity, however much humanity abandons him. Faith is the defeat of probability by the power of possibility. That is what Hanukka is about. The prophets dreamed the improbable and by doing so helped bring it about. All the great human achievements in art and science, as well as the life of the spirit, came through people who ignored the probable and had faith in the possible. Faith is the courage to take risk. Monotheism expects great things from us, and by doing so, makes us great. The Hasmoneans understood that God's call to them in that moment was not a call to martyrdom. They understood that in that moment, God's call to them was a call to greatness. And because they covenanted with God and they believed in the power of possibility and in the power of spirit, they were successful. It calls us the image of God, the children of God, God's covenantal partners. It challenged us to become co-builders with God of a gracious society and a more just world. And I want to finish because what we have done here is we've taken this idea of Darwin. We've looked at the idea of Greek and Judaism, Greek philosophy and the biblical spirit. And we have said that there is always a choice. We can see our existence as an amalgamation of DNA and genes and the physicality of our existence and say that that's fate. It's probable. It was probable we created. It was probable that we came into existence, and that's just what happened, and that's how it continues to happen. And who will survive? The people who will survive are the people who pass on the fittest genes to the next generation. And then there is a second narrative, and that narrative says, no, actually survival happens when I am not selfish but altruistic, when I don't just see the I but I see the we, when I don't just focus on what I had to gain from the reality and only see things externally, and when I see things under the surface and I understand that there's a bigger picture, and that in the end what I leave, what my legacy is not the external but the internal, what I represented, what values I followed, what covenantal partners I joined with, what things I did altruistically to leave my mark in this world. For Greek, the centrality of human beings belongs with humans. Humans are the be all and the end all. But there is a Greek myth called Prometheus. And in the Prometheus Greek myth, we speak about the idea of how fire came to the world, meaning how did humans become creative? And Prometheus, who is half god, half man, what he does is he takes fire and he gives it to man. And he basically does everything for them. He lights the fire, he shows them. And then these terrible, men who were these kind of cavemen in a dark age, they slowly begin to be civilized. But their civilization comes through the gods. Their civilization comes through giving fire to them. In Judaism, there's a beautiful midrash. And that midrash speaks about the idea that it was the Erev Shabbat. And on Erev Shabbat, as the sun is setting and darkness begins to approach, Adam becomes afraid. And what does he do? There's a serpent, the serpent that represents chaos. It's the primordial idea of chaos and disorder comes upon him. And he doesn't know what to do. And what does God do? God invites, literally says invites, his minlaw invites two stones and gives it to Adam. And what does Adam do with the two stones? He realizes that from the two stones, he can create fire. Fire, the idea of fire, is the ultimate way in which we create. If we look at all the stories, the story of Bavel, even earlier, right? The ancestors of Cain, right? They all use fire in order to be creative. Fire has the ability, is the source of man's creative abilities. But fire can also be something that we think it's only about us. God gives Adam the ability to light a candle in the darkness. It's both a very literal way of making fire so that he's warm and he has light, but it's also a metaphorical sense of being able to create meaning that dispels the darkness, that dispels despair, that allows us to overcome adversity. We have that ability as human beings to do two things. We have the ability to survive through fire, but we also have the ability to survive through spirit. And that's what fire is, the light. Hanukka story is this. Hanukka's story is the legacy of Adam on Motzei Shabbat. It is the legacy of Havdalah. It is when we light the fire and we say, God gave us the tools, but we have to take the initiative. That's covenantal reality. It's not that God does everything for us, and it's not that we do everything on our own. It's that we have the tools that God has given us, and we use those tools to light the fire. That's why the menorah stands as the symbol of Hanukkah. That's why the Kad Hashemen is the symbol of the Pach Hashemen, is the symbol of Hanukkah, because it is exactly the imagery of the covenantal relationship between man and God. We fought the battle, we made the military victory because historically the Hasmoneans understood that they needed to adopt a covenantal way of looking reality. But the miracle the consciousness of the miracle came from God. Because God gave us the light, we lit the menorah. We thought it would last one day. But because we did it and took initiative, God says, in your spirit, that's where miracles happen. Miracles happen from the spirit of the Jewish people. And that is exactly why Hanukkah focuses on the idea of light, because it is not about the Greek outlook of survival of the fittest or the Darwinian idea of the survival of the species. No, it is about the Jewish biblical idea of the survival of the spirit, of altruism, of knowing that together we will be able to defeat all the odds more than just on our own. That together we are able to bring about a victory. Now the Hasmonean victory was not full. They still didn't win back total sovereignty. And a few years later and there was a big debate whether or not to make it a chag. I want to finish with Rabbi Yitzchak. He says like this: the absence of fire from heaven was one of the greatest traumas of the Second Temple history. Instead, the Maccabees focused their liturgy on the menorah lighting. They bought the temple candelabrum, kindled the light, even as they bought incense and showbread. This was a natural highlight for the dedication. I want to just skip to the dots. Everyone was struggling to understand the significance and religious dimensions of the Hasmonean victory. The various interpretations turned on one primary question: was there a significant role for humans as active agents in the covenantal redemption process? Still, the ultimate gift of the Maccabees have given later generations may well be the holiday of Hanukkah itself. It took spiritual courage to recognize that marginal, sharply contested victory as the decisive redemption that it actually was. It took even greater courage to apply the classic model of the Exodus to the event. The Maccabees therefore decreed a holiday celebrating God's new redemption, even though it was achieved through human agency. And we know that the Haftarah for Shabbat Hanukkah comes from Zechariah. Yam v'yomei alai lemor. Zed Adonai al Zerubbabel lemor. Lo b'chai v'lo b'koch ki im beruchi amar Adonai tzavaot. It is not through strength or might or power, but through my spirit. That is the legacy of the Hanukkah story. Yes, narrative one is about the military victory. Josephus saw it through the eyes of Greek and Hellenistic culture. The Jews, they won because they were better fighters. The rabbi saw it in the pietist Hasidic way. It was only because of the miracle. But the truth is that the Hasmonean legacy is that we see it in the middle way. And the middle way is what? Covenantally, that we understand that yes, it's by military might, but it's also by divine spirit that we as the Jewish people have infused and internalized into ourselves. And that spirit that says we are going to take the stone and make the fire, and we are going to light the world through the warmth and the brightness of that flame, that's the spirit of the Jewish people. That's covenant. And that's what the Hasmonean dynasty legacy left for us today. And my prayer is that God's willing, that spirit will get us through, and we will have a victory very soon. Wishing you all a Chag Sameach. Any questions, come to me after. I'm going to go out to let the next speaker come.
Consciousness versus what consciousness? Religious consciousness versus consciousness.
Versus
I love